but maybe the hair was like that. uh, but anyway, yeah. So Jim and just for those of you uh, who were wondering who is this guy, I'm the one of the founders of FinerWorks, but Jim and I decided, hey, let's put together something which would really be of value to the photographers within, within our small community of artists and photographers. That would, well, it wouldn't just be for the photographers, but it'd be for everyone. A lot of artists find themselves gravitating to photography, or will, or have had gravitated to photography. And if you're like me, which many artists are, that you're self-taught. And one of the things that self-taught people find themselves doing is browsing YouTube and other, places on the web to try to get tidbits of information. Well, let me tell you, is the bits of information that Jim has been sharing relating to photography has been just, it's been astounding. It's been, it's been stuff that you're not going to be able to learn unless you pay someone, but he's providing this to everyone for free. With the help of FinerWorks. And so we're really excited to have Jim to be able to present an entire photography course in an hour and a half that is that anyone that plans on or has picked up a camera will find of value. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jim Landers of Landers Photo School.
And I'm going to give you control here. So let me go ahead and make sure all of our participants can get in really quick. I'm going to disable our waiting room so everybody can get in. And Jim, I will make you our host. And then what you'll want to do is just make sure to pin yourself up there, or put speaker view, so that when you're sharing your file, everybody will be able to see that.
I can see it. Okay. I'll hit record too. I've got my my little husky, 80-pound husky sitting next to me, and I can't get him to move. So if I'm a little off center, it's because he's big. I don't know what he's doing. He just won't move out of the way. I like him being there, just not during the show. Good boy. See you later. Okay, I guess he understood what I was saying. Well, Melissa, thank you. James, thank you. You guys rock. It's wonderful, the things that you guys do. I mean, we have the service that you provide is wonderful as it is, and you don't really need to do anything else because it is so great. FinerWorks produces wonderful products in short periods of time, and everybody is happy. But then you one up it. You're just saying, you know what, these people, we really like them. Our clients, we love them. We want to do more. And so you put things together like this and other things. This isn't the only one that you guys are doing. You put a lot of effort into the extras in addition to doing a fine quality product. And so you guys rock. I appreciate all the work that you do and how much you care about the creative community. So thank you guys for what you're doing. Hi, Marilyn. I like that photograph. So we're talking about manual mode today. I think a lot of people are very familiar with it, but to what degree is what would be the most contrast? Because I have definitely come across people who use manual mode who don't know how to use manual mode. They may have put it in program mode and let the camera decide the shutter speed, the f-stop, the ISO, and then just set that in their manual mode and think they're doing manual mode. Well, I guess by strict definition that is, but man, the number of tools you have available, and Melissa mentioned this just a moment ago, the number of tools you have available increases dramatically. Now, it'd be like, let's talk about something that everybody knows. We all know about tool stores. So let's talk about Home Depot or Lowe's real quick. Everybody knows what a hammer is and what a screwdriver is. But let's say you don't know anything about anything else in that store. Very, very few other things in that store. Does that mean all those other tools aren't any good? Of course not. Doesn't mean that at all. It just means you don't understand them. You don't know them yet, but they could make your life a whole lot easier and make your work 10 times better than it ever was before. But you don't know what you don't know. That's where the word ignorant comes in. I know a lot of people use that word incorrectly, so I want to make sure when I use it, I'm using the dictionary, that you know that I'm using the dictionary definition. Ignorant just means the things you don't know yet. That's it. It's not a description of how well you're able to accept and use information. It's just information you haven't received yet. You're unaware. So too many of us think, I know that, I've got it, I don't need any help with that area. Guys, I've been studying photography since 1975, and there's still a lot for me to learn. So if you haven't been studying photography as your full-time thing since 1975, then I guarantee you've got something to learn. So don't brush off opportunities to learn. I'm speaking to the choir though. You guys wouldn't be here if you didn't believe that. There's a lot that don't, but it's to your benefit that you're here. So thank you guys for being here. I'm going to be sharing my screen here in just a moment because I've got a handout. And it's the name of this is Manual Mode Basics. So I may as well just start showing that now. Let's see. I need a.
And I've put that again in our chat for those who just joined. And for those of you on YouTube, the Google Doc link is there in the chat as well.
Thank you. There we go. I think I just made it large enough. Now I'm going to share that with you guys. All right, Melissa, how's that look on your screen? Is that about the right size? Yes, awesome. Yay.
Forgot I muted myself.
Well, I saw your nod, so you still were communicating. Manual Mode Basics. Now, this is one section of one of my classes. It's called Photo 101. In fact, we have a Photo 101 in person starting in less than 2 weeks. It's Monday, the 12th or the 13th. It'll be twice a week, Monday, Wednesday, for 3 weeks in a row. It's 6 2-hour sessions, and it's going to be in person, so it won't be Zoom or YouTube or whatever. However you're watching this right now, this will be in person. And if you're curious about it, just go to landersphotoschool.com and then go to Photo 101. Again, in person, 6 2-hour sessions. But Manual Mode Basics is the 4th class of Photo 101 of the 6. And so, as far as that class is concerned, we're kind of starting in the middle of it, but based on the other sessions that we've had in the past for Photo Tips Monthly, this is right in line with where it's supposed to be. So hopefully you guys have been to those others, but even if you haven't, that's fine too, because we're going to go over this with enough detail where you don't have to have the others. It's just a benefit if you do. Today, in today's photography toolbox, we're going to be talking about your camera's exposure meter, contrast, and dynamic range. Now, you might be thinking, okay, I can see how the exposure meter has to do with Manual Mode Basics, but what about contrast? What about dynamic range? We're going to talk about that, and you'll see exactly why those things are included. You know what an exposure meter is, right? It's that thing that's on your screen. Sometimes it's the back of your camera. Sometimes it's the top of your camera. I've seen cameras where it's in both, but it's that little section that has if you've got it in a program mode, it has a 0 with a line underneath it. And if you're using exposure compensation, it might not be on the 0. It may be overexposed or underexposed. Real quick, Melissa, are you seeing my cursor? Yes? Okay. Good. So this box right here, that is your exposure meter. Some of them have a range of 2 stops on each side. Others have a range of 3, and I have seen some that have 5. But this is just a scale, and it just shows how much light is coming into the camera. It does not mean the exposure is right or wrong. It's just saying how much light's coming into the camera. Now, what's it based off of? Well, that's this next section, middle gray, the halfway point between solid black and solid white. The halfway point. If you had cans of paint, one was solid black, one was solid white, equal parts, a gallon each. If you were to mix them together in a 2-gallon or let's say 5-gallon tank to reduce the spillage, you had a 5-gallon bucket you poured them into and you mix them real well, you get middle gray, the halfway point between solid black and solid white. Your camera's meter doesn't know what it is that you're photographing. What it does know is the halfway point between solid black and solid white. Why is that important? If you know that variable, because that's a consistent thing, that's something you can rely on. If you have that variable, then you can adjust to any situation that you find yourself in, whether that's a bright situation and it's supposed to be bright, or it's a darker situation, a low light situation, and it's supposed to be low light. For instance, if you're photographing on a beautiful white sandy beach, let's say you're in Destin, Florida. You've got those beautiful white sand beaches, the turquoise and blue water. If you haven't been there, make a trip. It's beautiful. Now, it's not the only place in the world that has that, but that's the one I'm picturing in my mind right now. If you allow your camera meter to do its job, your photographs will be a little bit darker than you expect them to be. Because your camera meter's job, it only has one: to average the scene between solid white and solid black. That is the only job your light meter has. Now, your light meter doesn't understand color at all. It only understands shades of gray. So your camera meter reads shades of gray. In other words, everything's black and white to your exposure meter because it's not measuring color. That's something that we understand. I assume you don't have a color issue with your eyes, but for most of us, we understand things like contrast as far as color contrast, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment. But your exposure meter can't tell the difference between colors. It can only tell how much light is being reflected off the different surfaces. That's it. So just to read what I have here, this is how your light meter is calibrated. On a tonal scale, this is the midway point between black and white. Why are cameras calibrated in middle gray? It gives you a consistent or a reference point so you can compare the parts of the scenes. Now, you've got 3 or more metering modes on most cameras. So not only can it read the amount of light coming through the lens and hitting the image sensor, but you can also narrow that down. It doesn't have to take into consideration all of the light coming through. You can say, I just want it to pay attention to the center section, and that's called center weighted metering. Or you could have spot metering, which is just one spot in the middle. Spot metering. Now, there are other modes. You've probably seen, if you've got a Nikon, you've seen matrix metering. If you've got a Canon, you've seen evaluative. These are smart metering modes. So effectively, they're trying to judge what the subject is and narrow it down to just that, which sounds good on the surface, and it usually does a pretty darn good job, but not always. I know for sure you've seen images that you've created that were either too dark or too bright. And this is just your exposure meter. It's not a matter of it doing it wrong. It has nothing to do with it wrong or right. The exposure meter is never wrong because its job is to average the scene, the amount of light being reflected off all the surfaces, to middle gray. And it always does that correctly. The reason why you're going to see things that you consider wrong is because not all scenes do average to middle gray to be correct. That example I gave you of the solid white beach, it's supposed to be white. It's not supposed to be brought down to middle gray. So therefore that exposure will be too dark. But let's go to the opposite side of things. Let's say you're in an environment that is supposed to be dark. It will lighten that scene. So therefore that one will be, from your point of view, wrong also. So we just need to know. Now, in some classes in our Photo 101, we'll go into more detail on this, but I'll talk about the histogram. The histogram is a fantastic way to tell how much light in each one of the tones that you're receiving. Now, there's a tonal scale and there's actual color scales too. And I'm only talking about the tonal scale right now. But you've got a chart that shows from solid white all the way to solid black, and how much of each one of those tones, all the shades of gray in between, how much of each of those tones are represented in that photograph. Once you understand what that is, what it's doing, the histogram, once you understand its purpose, you can look at a histogram and know whether that exposure is correct or wrong. And it will become very easy. I know a small handful of photographers don't even bother looking at the photograph. They just care about the exposure being correct. And so instead of seeing the image pop up on the back of their screen, they're looking at the histogram. Now, a lot of them look at both, but even more of them don't really have a good understanding of what a histogram is. In Photo 101, I do go into more detail about that because that is an important variable. Here, I'm just going to touch on it because we don't have a huge amount of time for it. So let's talk about exposure. Well, let's talk about let's finish talking about the metering modes. So selective exposure and controlling the exact area of the scene that you want properly exposed with and understanding what happens to those areas. And so if I'm photographing a person, which is generally the kind of work that I do, I photograph people, I want to get a meter reading on their cheek. On the cheek. And I want that to be approximately middle gray. Now, you know that everybody has different skin tones. So you've got to take that into consideration as well. So, you know, I'm sitting here not that far off from this. So I've got to take that into consideration. But a lot of people's skin tones is right around middle gray. So it makes it kind of easy. But I want to get that exposure correct. I want to expose correctly on the highlight side, meaning the side with the light. Maybe both of them have light, but I want to get the light correctly exposed and deal with the shadows later if I need to. But I am exposing for the highlights, not the shadows. Should I spend any more time with metering modes? There's a ton more I could say on that one. You guys are good?
I mean, how does that differ? What do you get when you're in auto?
Auto is in its whatever the smart mode is. So evaluative if you're Canon, and matrix if you're Nikon. But it's the exposure meter that is the smart mode for that camera, and it really does do a good job a lot of times. Probably 80% of the time, you're going to be satisfied with the exposure that full auto mode gives you. You're absolutely going to be satisfied with it. But here's the problem. Auto mode, you mentioned this a little while ago, Melissa. Auto mode gives you control of only two tools. And neither one of them does the camera even have the ability to control. It's the only reason why you have control over them. One is when to press the shutter. Camera in auto mode still won't press the shutter for you. You have to do it. You could put it on delay, but you still have to start it. And the second thing is your composition. The camera's not moving around deciding what it is it's going to be in your frame. You have to do that. And so you have, no matter what, you always have when to press the shutter and what your composition is going to be. Choosing a different angle, zooming in, zooming out, getting closer, moving yourself backwards. You've got a lot of different variables, even with auto mode. But it's narrowed down to just two things. When you put your camera into program mode, you get control of two more things, ISO and flash, on some cameras, on a lot of cameras. And then when you move it into the priority modes, the aperture priority and the shutter priority, you gain control over whichever one you chose. So the shutter speed or the aperture, the amount of the size of the opening that lets light come in. That's measured in units of f stops, focal stops, in case you're curious. Focal stops, but no one calls it focal stops, f stops. And so your camera in its full auto mode doesn't give you a whole lot of options. It doesn't mean that it's not going to get a good properly exposed photograph. But if that were the only thing that determined whether a photograph was good or not, photography would be really kind of boring. So those of you who are in auto mode, I'm not saying that's a negative. I'm saying if you're in a tool store, you're limiting yourself to the hammer and the screwdriver. And you're not having anything to do with anything else. You've just opted out of learning them. And I don't know about you, but that seems kind of silly to me. But to each his own. I want you to be happy. If that makes you happy, having a limited amount of knowledge, be happy. So yeah, I want you to learn all the tools in the tool store, but only those tools that help you reach the goals that you have for your photography business, for whatever vision that you have. There's so much to learn in photography. I say this often, but if you were to stop what you were doing, just stop and study photography full time for the rest of your life. It doesn't matter whether you're 80 or whether you're 18. Even that 18-year-old would never learn all there is to learn about photography. There is that much information. It is that vast. I kind of chuckle when someone says, oh, I don't need that. I've got enough. I know enough. They know enough based on their level of knowledge, but they can't know what they don't know. So they're just unaware, maybe blissfully so. Again, I want you to be happy. So remain blissful if that's what you want. So good question, Melissa, about auto mode. You're going to get the right exposure. It is most of the time, at least 80% of the time, the exposure will be correct. But there's so many other things you have the ability to control once you become familiar with the tools. Now, thank you. All right, so let's move to exposure. Both shutter and aperture were designed to change the exposure in one-stop increments. A stop is a doubling or a halving of an amount of light. Now, that doesn't mean your camera is limited to doubling or halving an amount of light. You have quite a bit more control than that, because each little click, you're changing your f-stop, click, click, click. Each click represents a third of a stop. So that means you've got three. You've got thirds of stops available to you within every doubling and halving. So a stop is a doubling or halving, but you have like a dimmer switch on a light or on a ceiling fan. You have the ability to move in between those. And so if you just need a little bit more light, you don't need to double the light, just need one little click will take care of that. But they're measured in f-stops. So if you have an ISO of 100, if you move that to 200, that's one stop worth of light more light, larger number, more light. But you do have numbers in between the 100 and the 200, just in case you don't need that much of a difference. Same thing with shutter speeds, same thing with f-stops. You have numbers in between. So if you're on F8, then one stop less light is F11, but you've got F9 and F10 in between there to give you more of a dimmer switch, to change it just slightly. When you're in a program mode, let's say you're in shutter priority and you decide to make a change, your camera will automatically change the opposite variable. In this instance, that would be an f-stop. If we're in shutter priority mode and we've chosen 1/60th of a second, and you've decided that that doesn't stop the motion that you were trying to stop, and so you raise it to 1/25. That's not the only variable that is actually changing. It's the only one that you changed. But when you're in a priority mode, you have given your camera permission to change the other mode. So in this f-stop, in this scenario, f-stops. So it's changing your f-stop. When you go from 1/60 to 1/25th of a second, you are losing about half your light. And so your camera will compensate by adding light on the f-stop side of things, on the aperture. This is called an equivalent exposure. and you can read that here, but I'll read it for you. If you change the f-stop by 1 stop, let's say down, to bring in half the amount of light, and you increase the shutter by 1 stop to bring in more light, then you have exactly the same amount of light entering into the camera. So if you are doing this manually, if you make a change to 1, you will likely, if the exposure was correct, you will have to change the exposure of the others to make the light, the amount of light coming into your camera, identical. In other words, equivalent. If I change my shutter speed in manual mode, I must change either my f-stop or my ISO also, if I want the amount of light to be the same. So why would I ever want to do such a thing? Let's say that, let's say f-stops. Let's say that I want something in focus in my foreground, but I want the background to be blurred. And so I create an image and the exposure is correct. However, the background's not blurred enough. I want it to be more blurry. So if I take my f-stop to a larger number, that will make the background more blurry. Or I could actually just bring my subject further away from the background. That's an option too. But just using the tools on your camera, if I take my f-stop and change it to a larger number, let's say I go 3 clicks. I go from F11 to F10 to F9 to F8. I now have 1 stop more light, which means my exposure, if it was correct in the previous one, is now going to be too bright. So I've got to change either my ISO or my shutter speed in order to maintain that equivalent exposure. So photography is essentially a game of 2 or 3 functions between the aperture and the shutter. Now I say 3 because we're also talking about ISO, but let's come back to that here in just a moment. Each controls exposure and 1 side effect. And that's why I'm isolating just 2 for now. I'll come to the ISO here in a moment. Each controls the exposure and 1 side effect. Every single tool in photography. Now this is cool in some ways and a pain in others, but I think it's cool. Every tool in photography has an effect, the reason why it exists, and a side effect, something that it does as a result of its effect. Now, you go to visit a doctor and they give you a prescription, chances are it's going to have some effect. At least you hope that it has the effect that you intend, but it probably is going to have a side effect to go right along with it. Sometimes side effects aren't that great. Sometimes side effects are pretty darn cool. And you may have experienced that with prescriptions, but it's the same with your photography tools. With the shutter speed, you kind of already know what the side effect is. The effect is amount of light. It's the same on all 3. Shutter speed, f-stop, ISO, amount of light. The effect, amount of light. Side effect is where the differences come in. With an ISO, the side effect is increased grain with increased number. You raise that ISO number, you get increased grain size. The dots that make up the photograph, the pixels, you see those dots. They get bigger and bigger and bigger as the number of your ISO gets bigger and bigger and bigger. By the way, this is one of those cool things that is improving tremendously over time. Those image sensors are amazing today. Go back 20 years and you didn't even want to use ISO 400, well, maybe 400, but you didn't even want to use 800 because it just looked bad. Now every camera looks amazing in 800. You're just fine in most situations to go to 800, 1000, 1600, usually just fine. Some of them quite a bit higher than that. It depends on the age of the camera and the quality of that image sensor. So I can't really make a blanket statement about it, The blanket statement I'm making is the newer ones blow away the older ones when it comes to image sensors. Huge amount of difference. If you enjoy or want to print something that is appropriately sized for a good sized wall, so maybe like a 5x7. Oh, by the way, guys, when I say 5x7, I don't mean inches. I'm talking feet. 5x7 feet. James and Melissa, can you print a 5x7 footprint for somebody? Of course they can.
I keep forgetting I'm on mute. Yes, we can.
Yes, we can. Sounds like a slogan from a presidential campaign a few years ago. Yes, we can. Like so yeah. So when you're wanting to print something, and I say appropriately sized, I don't say big, because it's appropriately sized. It may be big compared to what you've done before, but if it's the right size for the wall, it's not big, it's just right. So compared to what? If it's appropriate, I like to call it appropriate. If you want to print that appropriately sized 5x7 footprint on someone's wall, on a business's wall, then the newer image sensors are going to do a much better job than the older ones. Huge amount of difference. So yeah, depending on what kind of work you do, you might want to have one of those newer ones. And so many variables out there, but the side effect of ISO, generally speaking, is the larger the number, the larger the grain. Shutter speeds. This is the one you probably have some idea of, but probably not complete. This is the one where you have the ability to stop or convey motion. I think most of you have the stopping motion down. You understand that a shutter speed has the ability to stop motion. Let's say you're photographing a baseball game. You probably are aware if you have that shutter speed fast enough that you can stop that baseball in midair. Maybe it's just come out of the pitcher's hand. Maybe it's the ball as it's just being hit by the bat, about to go over and get a home run. You know that it's possible to stop that kind of motion. Now, whether you have the right tool that's best for that's a different story. There are high-speed cameras, but you know, generally speaking, that a shorter period of time. So let's say between a 60th of a second and 1/2000th of a second. A 1/2000th of a second is really short period of time. These are fractions. Sorry for you guys that don't like math. These are fractions. So 1/2000 is a much shorter period of time. It stops motion. You could stop the motion of some hummingbirds at that shutter speed, although there's a lot that need a 4,000 and 8,000, and depending on how they're moving, even faster than that. So there's no blanket statement saying, oh yeah, you can stop a hummingbird at this shutter speed. Sorry. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. They move differently. They move at different speeds. So there isn't a one number that answers that question, but you have the ability with shutter speeds to stop motion, or the opposite, convey that motion. So if I'm photographing a waterfall, which we'll be doing in Photo 101, we'll go to a place that has several waterfalls, and we'll photograph those waterfalls. We'll do one where we stop the motion of every single little droplet of water. Probably going to need about a 2/50th of a second, a 500th of a second in order to do that. But then we're going to convey that motion. Conveying is kind of cool when it comes to shutter speeds and waterfalls. And you guys have seen this before. You've seen this on calendars. You've seen it on, if you were around in the 80s and 90s, there were these motivational posters that would say like perseverance or dedication. It'd be up on the walls of pretty much every office. And you'd see this, different scenes, but one always would be a waterfall, and it would be the soft flowing look of the water. Now, your mind's not fooled by that. You still know that it's water, but it kind of looks almost like cotton or tulle, or it just looks like something else because it's not something you can see with your own eyes. Your camera's not limited to the shutter speed that you have. Guys, you have a shutter speed. It's 1/24th of a second. Very narrow way to look at time. In fact, it's the most narrow way to look at time that there is. And yet to us, it's the norm. But it's incredibly narrow way of looking at how time works. And yet for most of us, it's the only way we'll ever know. But for photographers, we can expand on a human experience when it comes to time. Because when we're talking about shutter speeds, we're talking about time. If it's a longer period of time, you're collecting more motion during that time. And something you learn as you're doing this is that the things that you thought were visible are invisible, including you. You guys have taken my classes before. I've heard this before. But the fact is that humans are invisible, and it's very easy to prove it. In fact, you already know. If you turn off the lights and there are no light leaks, just you and your friend in a room, you turn off the lights, you still know they're there, but you can't see them. Why? Guys, humans are invisible. We require a third party to change that. Light. Which is what we do as photographers. Photography, light, drawing. That's what photography is. Drawing with light. That's our medium. Light is our medium. Now there's several mediums because you have to have an image sensor or film in order to collect it, but it's done with light. So you have the ability to collect time in a totally different way than you understand time. That is the side effect of shutter speeds. Now f-stops. The side effect of an f-stop is depth of focus. And you may have seen it written as DOF. By the way, just to be clear, that's not correct as far as the classical way of learning. It's called depth of field, not depth of focus, but field. I mean, gosh, I grew up here in San Antonio, Texas. And so a field to me is where the bluebonnets are. It's where the Longhorns hang out. I'm not talking about the football team in Austin. So to me, field didn't help me understand that concept, but depth of focus does. Let's say the camera is on this side. So we're talking about distance. If something is here and something is here, they're at different distances away from the camera. So you've got a camera, you've got a subject, and you've got a background over there. Let's say that this is even further. Let's say you're photographing someone in a backyard. So you've got the person, you've got a fence that's behind them. If you're up against the fence, there's nothing you can do. They're too close to the background to make a difference. But if you pull you and your subject away from that background and give yourself some distance, you can blur that fence to the point where you might not even be able to see it or tell what it is anymore. Let's say that you invited some family members to go see the Alamo because they're in from out of town. And so you go to downtown San Antonio and you want to do a photograph in front of the Alamo. You want to, you don't want to blur off the Alamo. You want to be able to tell what that is. And so you use a high numbered f-stop to get a greater depth to your focus. But if you don't like the background, if it doesn't help tell the story of why you're there, then you want to blur that background. So therefore you want a small numbered f-stop in order to do that. But always remember, with all of these side effects, when you make a change to that side effect, it is also making a change to the amount of light. Again, every single tool in photography has an effect and a side effect. And you do have to consider both, unless you want to stick with auto mode. And then I guess you don't have to worry about that. But we want control. I want the background to be blurry sometimes, but I also want it to be in focus other times. I want that bird to be caught in midair, but I also want that waterfall to look soft and flowing. Auto mode will never give me any of those things, not on purpose. It could do it by accident. But why would you want to do it by accident? Would you, if your goal was to build a birdhouse, would you choose to go by accident and see what it, maybe it'll be a birdhouse? No, you're going to find out what you need to do. You're going to get the combination of tools that you need in order to do it, and you're just going to do it. At least I think most of us will. So generally speaking, we decide which side effect matters more: time, depth of focus, and then choose an aperture or a shutter accordingly based on getting the correct exposure. And then we use the opposite function to balance our meter to make sure we get the correct amount of light. Opposite meaning, if I chose shutter speeds because I want to stop motion, then I'm using f-stop to get the correct amount of light. Finally, we use our ISO when we can't easily balance our meters, knowing that increasing it will slightly compromise the image. Now, if you're at 100 and you just need to raise it a little bit, it's not going to do anything. I want to keep my ISO at 100 most of the time. And I do come across photography teachers that say, start with your ISO. I understand why they're saying that. And I'm not going to tell you they're doing it wrong. I'm not going to tell you that it's bad advice. I'm going to tell you that you're going to come back to it at the end anyway. So why start with it if you've got to come back to it in the end? So I just leave my camera on 100 ISO. I make my choices of shutter speed and f-stop. And then based on what I need at that point, I will have to sometimes change that f-stop. Excuse me, that ISO. So that's the order in which I do it: shutter speed or f-stop, whichever one I'm using. Sometimes I'm using both side effects, but most of the time it's only just one. And then ISO's last. It's always last. All right, so I mentioned earlier contrast. Understanding contrast, understanding creative exposures. So let's define contrast real quick. Contrast is not necessarily something that can be controlled. However, it is important to understand the nature of contrast. So there's three things, and they are right here on the handout. Light influences contrast more than color influences contrast. You see in the text there, a white wall with black paint on it. You will agree it has contrast. Of course it does. But it does not have as much contrast as a solid white wall that has a shadow coming across it. Now, I do have to generalize because how much light is is on that wall, and how dark is that shadow. So yeah, there are some variables here, but generally speaking, the solid white wall with a shadow coming across it has more contrast than a wall that's painted half white and half black. I'm gonna give you another example. There is a plant called a poinsettia. I have heard people call it poinsettia also, whichever way you say it, poinsettia. And there are multiple different types of that plant, just like there's multiple different types of a lot of plants. But the one I'm thinking of is the traditional Christmas one that is red leaves on top and green leaves on bottom. It's half and half red, half green. You guys have seen these, right? You know what I'm talking about? Poinsettia plants, solid red, solid green. Your camera's meter, if it had a brain, would say they're the same. And the reason that your camera's meter sees the same is because the same amount of light is being reflected off of the red leaves as being reflected off of the green leaves. So therefore, your camera's meter would see them both as gray. The red wouldn't be darker or lighter. The green wouldn't be darker or lighter. they would be identical. No difference whatsoever. Your camera meter reads how much light is being reflected off surfaces. You, as a human, are seeing color contrast. And that's a pretty big color contrast. But as far as your camera meter is concerned, there's zero difference there. They're identical. Number two, quality of light. Hard light versus soft light. A lot of variables here. Time of day is a variable. Overcast day versus a bright sunny day. Maybe you're in a studio, so you've got your studio lighting. A lot of variables here. Hard light, soft light, quality of light. So this plays a role. This is an important variable here. When if let's say you're a landscape photographer, one of the things that I think you should take into consideration is what time of day is best to photograph the thing you want to photograph. And there's a lot of tools for that. There's apps, there's websites for that kind of thing. There's tons of tools out there. You look them up. Photographer's Ephemeral and there's a really good one that's popular, and for some reason I'm not thinking it. But Photographer's Ephemeral is a good one. Golden Hour, another good one. But there's a bunch. There's a bunch out there. Just look at it and plan the time of day when you're going to be at the subject, so that the light is right. There are some subjects that are facing north that the only time of day, even the only time of year that they ever receive any light is very specific and very limited. So there's apps out there to help you get it just right. But it can't take into consideration the weather, because it doesn't know whether that's going to be a bright sunny day, an overcast day, a rainy day. You can't know that. Those are things that you have to play as you go along. If you're outside, if you're inside and you have control over the light, well, then you're in control. But outside, you're just not. But there is a huge amount of difference in contrast when there's hard light, not being diffused by the clouds, versus light that is being diffused by clouds. And how thick are those clouds? In your mind's eye, you can picture your car. You open up the car door, you can see the shadow that your car door is creating on the ground. And it is so sharp on a bright sunny day that you could take a pen or a pencil and put a line on the ground exactly where that is. Now let's take an overcast day. It's hard to tell where the shadow starts, where it ends. It's hard to tell because it's softer light. Some people would say a higher quality light. Not everybody agrees with that. It's just different. By the way, the brighter, the harder the light is, the more sharp the image can be. That doesn't mean you can't get sharp images on an overcast day, though. Doesn't mean that even slightly. Number 3, after differences of light and quality of light, color, which you might have thought would have been up at the top, but we talked about it a moment ago. Color is the final influence on contrast, but does not generally have anywhere near as much impact on either of the first two. And I put in parentheses there, which is a surprise to most people, because color contrast is usually the first thing that we think about. The differences between two colors, rather than a shadow versus a highlight. Now, your camera has a certain range of tones, from the darkest shadows to the brightest highlights, that it has the ability to bring in. Has a certain range. The newer cameras have a greater range. The majority of cameras have about 5 stops worth of light that they have the ability to bring in. You as a human have around 14 stops worth of light that you can bring in. The newest cameras have 14 and 15 stops. At least they say they do. Some of them are a little bit less than they say, but that doesn't matter. This is range of tones, stops. This is how, let's say this is how much is, let's say this is 15. You've only got 5. So what happens to that area that's on that highlight side? It gets crushed into solid white. What about that area on the shadow side that you can see detail in? On your photograph, it gets crushed into solid black. There's no detail there. You have the ability to move that scale over by bringing in more light. But what does that do on that highlight side? It gives a greater area that's crushed into solid white. But you could also move that over to the highlight side. What does that do to the shadow area? Makes a greater amount of it solid black. This may be where you're thinking about HDR, if you've heard of it before, high dynamic range, where you create an image in that shadow area that's correctly exposed, an area right in the middle, and then one that's correctly exposed on the highlight side, and merge them together. Use the best of each one of them to create one image that you can see just as much as your eyes can see, if not more. Again, there are some cameras that's their native. That's what they do, but not most. Although eventually it probably will be all. Wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, so we humans can see about 14 stops worth of light. And I've got a step scale that I would use in my classroom and let you and just look at it, see how much light you could see. And most people were somewhere on the low end, it'd be 12. And I did come across a handful of people that could see 15 or 16, but pretty much everyone was 14 or 15 stops of light that they could see at any one time. That's your dynamic range. But not all cameras have the equivalent range of tones that you have as a human. So it's one of the #1 reasons why photographs do not come out the way you expect them to. Not because it's exposed improperly, but because it didn't have the latitude, didn't have the range of tones available in it that you could see with your own eyes. So it was disappointing to you. You've had times when you said, that doesn't do it justice. That doesn't look like I saw. It doesn't look anywhere near as good as what I saw. Sometimes it's because of dynamic range. Sometimes you can blame it on dynamic range. Yeah. So how do you guys feel about all that? I have a homework assignment.
Yeah, I was gonna say there's a lot there, and I'm also guessing too in your other class that goes in more in depth. I'm guessing you're able to kind of give more features, more. You know, there's I know, just like I said, to me, manual mode is always so overwhelming, just because there is a lot to do with that. I'm guessing if you're somebody who's going to look into investing in more lenses, lens filters, manual mode is probably something you probably really want to master if you're going to make that investment. Would you say that's true?
I would generalize and agree with that, but obviously everybody's going to do what they feel is best. So, so yeah, I would hope so. There's so much as far as money that you can invest into your equipment, but also time. Because the more equipment that you have, if you're going to learn to use the tool and the majority of the things that it has the ability to do, it is time consuming to learn those things. Even if you have a teacher, even if you're using a YouTube video, and those of you who are self-taught, which is a lot of people are self-taught. Those who are classically trained kind of like to giggle about the self-taught, because there's that, what's that Confucius saying, that if you have yourself as a teacher, your master is a fool. So yeah, we kind of like to giggle about that, but there's so many tools available. You can learn a lot on your own. YouTube is a good source. I mean, watching these videos here that FinerWorks puts on YouTube, and all the other things available on YouTube, there's a ton of stuff out there. You can learn a ton. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. If there is a bad thing about YouTube, if it has no ability for structure. So when we're in a situation where there's been plenty of times when I've been in a situation and then someone says, do you have any questions? And my first thought is, I don't know enough to ask any questions. So YouTube requires that you know enough to ask some questions, because you have to enter something in the search category. And then once you do ask a couple of questions, you get some information here and it's good. You get some information here and it's good. You get some information here, you get some information there. There's some information back here, some information over there. There's information all over the place, but what keeps them together? Nothing really. There's no structure. So you're asking a question here. You get some kind of an answer. It might be a really good one. And you get some question answered over there, and you get an answer of some sort, whether it's great or not. It's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about it lacks structure. It has no ability to have structure. And so it isn't a negative thing. It's still positive. It's just nowhere near as good as classical learning, where everything is structured. Everything does connect to the next thing. Therefore, there are fewer gaps in the education, the understanding that one would have. Now, that doesn't mean they paid attention in class. And everybody does learn it differently. Absolutely. So I've got students that they can't stand being around other students. They have to do a private class. And so I tell them before we start, you understand that means a higher price, right? Because when you've got 5 students, effectively they're spreading the cost of the teacher by 5. So they're not paying the full cost. And when it's just one, that one person has to pay for that one teacher's time. And they every time are like, oh yeah, I know that. That's fine. You know, it's not that I want to pay more. It's just that's how I learn. So that's what I want to do. That's what we're doing. And that's fine with me, whether it's a group or whether it's an individual. But I want to make sure, of course, that they know that that's what's coming. But yeah, the Photo 101 that starts next week on Monday, and it's 3 weeks in a row, Monday and Wednesday, 6 to 8 p.m. What is that? I should have looked at the calendar. That's September.
Well, I think this
12th.
Monday?
No, 13th, September 13th. Yeah, so a week from Monday, September 13th.
And do you think with manual mode, do you think there's, especially with DSLRs as opposed to like film cameras, do you think there's more, do you have to give more into calibration of the equipment as far as like how well, how long will your camera stay calibrated to give you those good light readings? It's funny because I've never known, I've never actually gone all the way digital on a DSLR. I still have a Pentax K1000 sitting here. So
Awesome.
but and I trust that, but even those back then, you still had to like sometimes sand or whatever. I'd have to take my whole camera apart and clean things out. But with DSLR, is there calibration that has to be done?
I like that question. No.
No.
And the reason probably why you're even thinking about it is the monitors do have to be calibrated. Mm-hmm. So your computer monitor, no matter how good it is, and there's some amazing ones out there, it does need to be calibrated every once in a while. Mm-hmm. And even some of them don't even calibrate well at all, but the monitors should be calibrated regularly, and regularly is kind of based on your use. Mm-hmm. The room that you use it in, there's a lot of variables that play into that. But some will calibrate their screen every single time they use it. That to me is kind of overkill. But I mean, if that feels like it's the right thing for your workflow, well, feel free, go ahead. I would say no more than twice a month. Mm-hmm. So 1st and 15th kind of a thing. But there's also the ones that are constant monitor, where they're always monitoring, and I have never used that, so I don't know anything about that. Mine is something that it's just a little piece of equipment that I stick on the screen itself, and it goes through this process of colors, and at the end it shows me before it does that part on it. And so I used to have a a monitor or a calibration unit that would just suggest to me what I should do. This one that I have now just does it, but it does show me a before after, and it says, do you accept the changes? And of course, yeah, every time I do, but it's amazing to me each time it needs it. It needs a change. And so, you know, why is that? I don't know. The computer screens do degrade over time. I'm sure there's other reasons for that, but yeah, it is a little bit different each time. It's never massive amount of change, but it is always a difference. Do you guys find that, Melissa and James? Do you change your, or do you calibrate your monitor every once in a while?
Yeah, I do. The ones over there at FinerWorks, James, Foster and Moore, do they have to go through calibration?
Yeah, they do. It also depends on the system that they're working on, because but generally, we'll say generally yes, because there's just because especially with the clay printing, where you know, the potential for lack of consistency is going to be more noticeable if they're not working on a calibrated monitor. So if let's say something's out of whack, or the printer's out of whack, you know, for whatever reason, maybe print head's clogged, then they need to they have their calibrated monitors to check, you know, see if the print's matching what's outputting.
And as far as what tools to use for that kind of thing, there are several different calibration tools for that. Probably one of the better ones and easy to get, a lot of information out there about it in case you need help, is probably the Data Color Spider. Do you guys use that, or do you use something else?
Sorry, keep muting myself. Yes, that's exactly what we're using over here.
Okay, yeah, that's one I normally recommend.
Yeah, I know Marilyn was just asking, you know, what we all use for calibration. I know FinerWorks offers a calibration card in our starter kit. And I mean, that's like, if you want a low tech where you don't have to go buy a device, it's kind of like eyeballing it. But I mean, I've done pretty good with that calibration card for my stuff. So, you know, like I said, and in some of our previous First Tuesday videos, I think it's preparing your clay prints. James kind of goes on about how to use that calibration card, but yeah, there's all sorts of stuff.
It's kind of like, okay, well, you know, it's not perfect, but you know, it gives me ballpark as far as, you know, where my tones are. So if you're basically with that calibration print, you're holding it up in front of your computer, you're opening up the PDF file that we have on our website under the calibration print or the starter kit section, and then you're adjusting your monitor. Now I'm going to warn people that are saying, oh great, now I know how to calibrate my monitor, okay, so that my images look correctly. And maybe Jim will tell me differently, but your run-of-the-mill computer anymore is almost impossible to calibrate the way it used to be. It's, you know, your laptops that, you know, I don't know if you guys remember, but where you had all these, you know, the series of buttons at the bottom of the computer screen, and where you could adjust the gamma level, you could adjust the hue, the contrast, and all that. Well, a lot of those features have been removed, or they're built into the software of your Windows software or your Apple's, you know, operating system software. So, you know, calibrating your monitor is not very easy anymore, like as easy as it used to be. Or at least that's since I feel. And many monitors, I simply have not been able to calibrate. I mean, we have screens here, computers here, beautiful monitors. images look great, but I can't calibrate them worth a darn. They just don't have that ability.
I think one time we had
I
a
didn't know
customer
that.
asking about a recommendation from you, James, about what kind of monitor,
The-
and you were
there-
telling him to go get one of
NEC has some great monitors, but if you truly want to be able to calibrate your monitor to the level that I'm going to say, your high-end professionals are doing, you're going to have to invest. You don't expect to spend close to $1,000 for just a monitor. Don't your laptop, your MacBook Air Pro, whatever, definitely not your iPad, or your phone is going to be able to say get that sort of quality.
Yeah.
You find as a portrait photographer, James, Jim, that is it better to shoot and have it appear on a monitor and that's already calibrated, that you're seeing all of this stuff? I know Kevin Saunders, when you go to his studio, and it's that massive studio, he's had those monitors going on some of his sessions, and he sees them right away, what they look like. And again, I know his monitors, he goes through a calibration system that he does. And if you've seen his, portrait stuff too, it's wow, it's a high-end stuff that he does in that studio. Do you find that it's beneficial as a portrait photographer to have, instead of relying on just the small camera viewfinder there of a small screen, is it better to have that all set up and see it on a nice calibrated screen?
It is. Depending on what you do, it's not an option, but in a studio, being able to see that photograph on a screen is way better than looking at it on the little screen on the back of your camera. The little screen on the back of your camera is a convenience. It's fantastic. It blows away what film cameras had, which was nothing on the back.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is fantastic by that comparison. But the big screen monitor, using something like tethertools.com, using those tools that cause you to connect from your camera to a monitor, to a computer, and to a monitor, blows away the screen you have on the back of your camera. But if you're photographing on location, that kind of thing isn't an option exactly. There are some things that, like a small rig. I don't know if you're familiar with smallrig.com. You can have this case, this metal box that you put around your, just in case is your camera. It makes it where you can connect things onto it. One of the things you could connect to it is like a 7-inch monitor, which is kind of ridiculously big, but it's way bigger than the little tiny screen that you have on the back of your camera. And so it makes it just a little bit better. If you're doing video, then you probably should do something like that. But with it's more of an inconvenience for a lot of us. So somebody like Jack Smith, who's going to be out in the field photographing bear cubs, he probably doesn't want to have a whole bunch of extra stuff he's carrying around with him. And I don't think I would. If I was able to hang out in one spot for a long time, okay, I probably would want it in that instance. But for convenience purposes, the screen on the back of the camera is fine. But is it as good as connecting it to a monitor and making your decisions from the monitor? No, it's not.
So when learning in manual mode, what's the best way in the field to kind of look at your photos? I always tell people to soft proof stuff before sending for printing. And a lot of that's looking at 100% is what we tell people. Look at your image at 100% so you can see that. Is that the best in the field that you have, is to go ahead, really just kind of zoom in?
It is.
And that's going to be what you're going to have, which is a lot better. Like you were saying, when you used to film, you have to wait Fox Photo for 5 or 7 days before you got to go look at your pictures and just to realize your thumb was in front of everything. But it's like I said, everybody wants that immediacy to it. So checking how you're doing and how you're progressing in taking your photos in manual mode I guess, like you said, it'll be the best thing you can do to look at them will be just to kind of zoom in and check on the small screen and see how your image came out there till
Yeah.
you're able to
If
get home
you
and blow it up.
That's exactly right, Melissa. You couldn't have said it better. The little screen on the back of your camera, again, it's good, but you do have the ability, like you said, to zoom in on it. Not you have the ability now, whether you have the time or not, depending on what it is you're photographing, because you may need to go photograph after photograph to keep that going, do several of them, and you don't have time in between each one of them to check. But when you do have time to check, it is a good idea to do such thing. For instance, if I'm photographing a group of people, it is a smart idea to zoom in and make sure that it is sharp. Because if it's not sharp enough, that is something that is frustrating. Now, there are tools out there to help with that. Help is the key word here. You need to get it right in camera. But if it's off by just a little bit, Topaz Labs has a program that can be used. And I don't know if you guys ever use Topaz Labs for like Gigapixel or something, but they have something called Sharpness AI or AI Sharpness. I forget which side the AI is on. That is a pretty impressive program. It may not be 100%, but it can improve, has the ability to improve a close focus that's off a little bit. If it's off a lot, forget it. It's not going to do anything.
I always want to try that software out on the old 8 megapixel digital stuff that had first come out that I have a ton of sitting on floppy disk somewhere. But yeah, I hear a lot of good stuff about Topaz. I've had several photographers bring it up. So
Luminar is another one that's really good with that. The Skylum, good product. So Topaz Labs isn't the only one. And no, I'm not an affiliate with any of those guys. So me saying that doesn't make me any money, or it doesn't make FinerWorks any money either.
Yeah, that's just something we just kind of hear in the conversation. um, we're getting close to the end. I know you had some homework you kind of wanted to talk about. Did you want to touch base on that so that people can use that hashtag PTM homework and Photo Tips Monthly homework, however you want to do it? Just give us that hashtag so we can see it, and I'll let Jim share those topics.
Did Marilyn raise her hand?
Oh, she had asked about which we did get to which monitor.
So we already took care of it. Okay.
Yes, we did.
Okay, good. That wasn't a follow-up question, was it?
No.
Okay. Good. All right. So and because I was thinking about Marilyn, I was only partially listening to you. You said go over the homework. Okay, let me do that. All right, so back to sharing the screen. There we go. Homework. Choose 3 subjects that have different amounts of contrast or color. Using your exposure meter, choose the correct exposure. Now, in my physical class, what I do is I have them what's called zero out the meter, where they are purposefully moving that little meter until it gets right up into the 0. And then I have them create an image. Everybody calls it take a picture, but that to me seems like incorrect English, so I can't say it. Take a picture. You can't take something that doesn't yet exist, and the photograph hasn't been created yet, so you can't take it. Now, if there's a photograph on someone's wall and you really like it, and you're that kind of person who takes things, okay, that would be called taking a picture. But I call it creating because it hasn't been created yet. So why did I bring that up? Hard. It's all right. So, I have them zero out the meter and they create that image by pressing the shutter release, and then they look at it and then they make a determination. Do I like the exposure on this one? I also want them to consider what other variables were important to them in that image. Did they get the depth of focus that they wanted if they were after a shallow depth of focus or a large depth of focus? Did they stop the motion if they were trying to stop motion? Did they convey the motion the way they wanted to if they were trying to convey it? So I want them to have those already. Of course, I want them to consider that. But in this assignment, the goal is, does that photograph look ideal? And if it doesn't, get it right. There's basically 2 steps in manual mode. 1, zero out the meter. 2, get it right. And once you become really good, you can skip to step 2. Don't even have to do step 1. But it takes a while to get to that level of comfort. So using your meter, choose the correct exposure. And that means that there are times when you have to take that second step and do something to get it right. Changing your shutter speed, your f-stop, or your ISO. But it can't be the one that you chose for its side effect. So you're photographing a car driving down the street, and you have purposefully stopped the motion of the car. Well, you can't change the shutter speed now if the amount of light was wrong. You've already chosen that. It's like if you're picking teams, in elementary school, you're picking teams. Once a team member has been picked, you can't pick that person again. Same thing here. Once you've picked shutter speed for its side effect, you can't pick it anymore. But you still have 2 more left, f-stops and ISO, in that order. Number 2, create 1 image in monochrome, which is black and white. In your menu, you can find monochrome. You may have to Google it or look into your manual if you got one of those. But create 1 in monochrome. Create a second one in color, changing nothing about those 2 images. The only variable that changes is one's black and white, one is color. The only difference between the 2. The exposure is identical. It's just the way you think is right.
And you recommend the tripod on both of those images, correct?
Yeah, I definitely, thank you for asking. I definitely recommend using a tripod, and that's to keep it consistent.
Okay.
But when you're looking at the 2 of these images, I want the only difference that you see is one's in color, one's in black and white. Now you might think, well, I could just create 1 in black and white and tell the lab to print me 1 in color and print me 1 in black and white. No, don't do that. First, I want to know that you know how to make 1 in color, in black and white. But second, it is different. It's not the same thing. But I want you to be able to look and see the contrast, the color contrast. Like if you photograph that poinsettia, you'll see that both leaves are identical. And it's because your camera's meter has no understanding of your understanding. The camera's meter only knows how much light's being reflected off of the surface. It's kind of like photography is like learning a whole new language. So therefore, we've got to think like the camera. Well, the camera's meter thinks in shades of gray how much light is being reflected off of the surface. This is not how we humans think about it at all. This will help us see it and understand it the way the camera understands it. And I repeat, number 4, I do suggest that you repeat this 2 more times, because it helps to solidify this understanding. If you do it just once, it's still kind of surface level. Doing it 2 more times, you've got a lot more things to think about. Different subjects. When I say 2 more times, different subjects.
How about image file type on the camera? Should they be the TIFF, JPEG, or RAW file when you're doing all of these?
My students in this Photo 101 I recommend just doing it in JPEG. Okay. But that's because one of the things we go over is color balance, and I want them to learn how to do it in camera. However, on your own, RAW is the better file type. And I have to generally say RAW is a better file type, because let's say you're photographing an event and they need those photographs 5 minutes after the event ends. Mm-hmm. Okay, now JPEG becomes the best, because you have time to process them in 5 minutes. With an exception like that, RAW is, with the exception of something like that, RAW is the better file type always. But because I want them to narrow down the variables and be able to control them, I do in my classes, the Photo 101, tell them to do JPEG.
Okay. Well, great. Well, like I said, and if you have any of those results you want to share on Instagram or social, just hashtag it with PTM for Photo Tips Monthly homework. And Jim and I can kind of keep searching around, and we'll see if we see any of those come up. Jim, do you have anything with PhotoSA coming up? I think October you have something coming up, right?
Yeah, we sure do. I think I have that handy too. Let's check. Yep, sure do. Let me share that. All right, so right now I'm about to share with you the PhotoSA page. And let's see, I meant to be on the events page, but it's close enough. So it shows you the upcoming events. And on Monday, we'll be talking about a photographer who is putting together an event called Elevate Exhibition. She's going to be showing, there's going to be photographers who are showing their work at a place downtown. It's going to be kind of cool. And then on Tuesdays, and that's going to be online, but on Tuesday, this is going to be in person, and we haven't done any in-person stuff in a while. So this one we're bringing in, well, in combination with CSAP, another camera club here in San Antonio. They're actually the ones that contacted this person and brought him in. They just asked if we wanted to be a part of it. But Linda Nickel, who is a travel and landscape photographer out of Austin, is coming to Chester's Hamburgers on 410 in Alamo Heights, the northern part of Alamo Heights. And so she's going to be talking about the kind of things that she does with her portrait her travel and landscape photography. And on September 9th, photography in public parks. This is the regular monthly PhotoSA meeting. And what used to be done at the Dominion Country Club is still now being done online via Zoom. And so you could come here to click on it to get that Zoom link. But this is Alicia Calzada, and there's going to be a second person there as well. And I have his name, but I just haven't changed that. We changed that after I created the graphic, and I guess I'm never going to get around to fixing the graphic. But there's two lawyers who are also photographers who are going to be talking about your rights as photographers when photographing in public parks. So copyrights, usage rights, all different kinds of stuff. This is valuable information. I think everyone should pay attention to. So whether you're a portrait photographer, landscape photographer, whatever kind of work you do, this is going to be beneficial on the legal side of things, which most photographers really don't know a whole lot about, including me. And so Alicia has been doing this for a long time. She is much more on the law side than she is on the photography side. She loves photography, but she earns her living as a lawyer. And the other person, I think, is in reverse. I think he does more on the photography side than he does on the lawyer side, but they both are playing this role. And she was on a part of a team that you guys may have heard about this being in the legal system right now about photographing in public parks. She was on, there was the main team, and they had some people who did some specific things for it. She was on one of those teams, and she's going to share what the most recent stuff that she's able to share. There's actually some stuff that they're still working on. She can't tell us, but she can tell us the most up-to-date information that anybody can tell you on the rights that you have, and especially when photographing in public parks. So that is Thursday, September 9th at 6:30. And so, and what I have next is that Photo 101 on September 13th, Monday, September 13th. That is also, that one is in person. That's not being done via Zoom. And so we meet in different places. So I used to have a physical space. Language Photography School was in the same space for 17 years, but COVID decided I didn't need an office anymore. And I was a little upset about that at first. I didn't like it, but now I kind of like it. Costs a whole lot less not having an office. I bet James knows a little something about that. The expenses of having an office. So I kind of like that. But this one is in person because Photo 101 really does need to be taught in person. And so we're going to meet in the place where the lesson is most beneficial. So we'll be meeting at the Dominion Country Club. We'll be meeting at the waterfalls on the left side of the parking lot at Bass Pro Shop. We'll be meeting at the Alon Hotel. We'll be going different places that fit what it is we're going to be talking about for that lesson. And so that's 2 times a week, Monday and Wednesday evenings, 6 to 8. So hopefully that fits most people's schedule.
Yeah.
And that's coming up.
And now next month for Photo Tips Monthly, you're going to be going over color balance, creative exposure, and filters. You want to give just a kind of a preview of what that is going to entitle?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking. So next month, these are pieces that are often left out. They didn't used to be left out of basic classes, but they're kind of left out now. Filters. Let's focus on that one for just a moment. There used to be hundreds, maybe thousands of different filters that photographers used regularly. And because of Photoshop being able to create and manipulate afterwards in post, there's a lot of filters that have now been eliminated from any need whatsoever. They're just unnecessary because you can do it in post. And if you were to do it with a filter, you actually cause it to only be able to be used for that purpose. Whereas when you do something in post, you can use a whole bunch of different tools on that same image. And so you're unlimited, where you were limited with the regular filters. But there are 3 filters that you still should be using because they can't be done in post. To some degree they can, but not well. And so we're going to talk about those 3 filters that made it through the digital change. They went from before digital into after. So BD to AD. I guess we're not in after digital, we're current digital, whatever it is. But there are 3 filters that made it through that process. They still are necessary tools. You could argue that there's a 4th, but I'm not even going to bring it up. And what were the other 2? I've all of a sudden forgotten.
Let's see, color balance and creative exposure.
Oh yeah, okay. Color balance, creative exposure. We touched a little bit on creative exposure today, but we'll spend a little bit more time with that. We'll be talking about a little more about the dynamic range. We'll be talking about the differences between different types of light, because when you can photographing the same subject, but with different exposures can totally change its story. There's lots of ways to change a story. For instance, changing the shutter speed could change the story of a Ferris wheel. If you stopped its motion, can you tell the difference between whether it was stopped letting people off or whether you chose a shutter speed fast enough to stop the motion? Can't really tell. But there are ways to be able to change the same subject by changing exposure, by having creative exposure. And then when it comes to color balance, if you're photographing in JPEG, color balance in camera absolutely matters. So that event that I'm photographing that they need the photographs 5 minutes after the event is over, I have to pay attention to color balance. I've got to get it right in addition to every other variable. But when it comes to RAW, that can be done in post. And actually, in many cases, should be done in post. Because you've got a huge amount of leeway with RAW that you don't have as much. I'm not saying you have no leeway in JPEG, because there is leeway in JPEG. But a JPEG has a very, very specific thing, and that is to reduce a file size. So it gets rid of things that you've effectively said, I don't need. And so we'll talk about what that difference is and why it is best to photograph in RAW, and then what you're supposed to do to make it right. And part of what's right is whatever you feel is right. Like beauty is in the eye of the beholder, so is color balance.
Right. And that'll be Thursday, October 7th. So the year's going by really fast. It'll be now third quarter, end of the year, getting there. See 2022 soon. We totally, thank you. As you went through that list, I was like, wow, do you see how much Jim is doing? Like almost on a daily, you must be doing several different things going on. I was just like, wow, that's a lot just for September that we have going on with just PhotoSA. That's not even going on with the school. And so we really appreciate the time you take out to do these for us. like I said, we want to remind everybody that we have that 33% off Labor Day sale here at FinerWorks on our dye bond metals, our HD metals, our frames, mats. Am I forgetting something else there, James? So those are going on, and just make sure to go to finerworks.com and you have all the details up at the top for that sale. And again, thanks a lot. And thanks to everybody who joined us here on Zoom. Marilyn, Jack, thank y'all so much. And if you're watching on YouTube, thank you. And if you're watching the playback on YouTube, go ahead. And if you have any questions, put them in the comment section. We'll try our best to get those answered as fast as we can. And talk to you guys all soon.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate you being here. You did a great job, Melissa and James. Thank you, Jack, for being here, and look forward to seeing you guys next month, if not sooner.
Yep.
We'll see y'all. Bye.
Bye for now.
And we'll let you end the call there.